Deep Purple were formed in 1968 and played their first official gig in Denmark in March of that year. But one of the most interesting stories about that early period in their career is the unusual way in which the band came together and the original concept behind the group. In this video, we're going to explore how a bunch of musicians who came from fairly different backgrounds came together to form one of the bands that pioneered heavy metal. Let's begin. Chris Curtis, who was the Searchers' drummer from 1963 to 1966, played a major role in the formation of Deep Purple. Curtis was an essential part of the Searchers' sound, and he contributed to the band's characteristic vocal harmonies with his distinctive voice. In addition to that, he also wrote most of the band's original songs. But Curtis also suffered from severe mental health problems. The Beatles, who played with the Searchers at the Cavern on many occasions, referred to him as Mad Henry. Curtis was also gay, at a time when homosexuality was still illegal in Britain, and this only helped increase his paranoia. Curtis left the Searchers in mid-1966 after an extensive Australian tour with the Rolling Stones. Accounts of the breakup differ, but there were some significant incidents during the tour and Curtis had become unreliable. Curtis hated Australia, and he was abusing a variety of substances to the point where he fell off the stage at one venue. By 1967, Chris Curtis started taking LSD, and he became well known in the London scene as an eccentric character. During one of his many acid trips, Curtis had the idea to form a group called Roundabout. His vision was a supergroup, where the band members would get on and off like a musical roundabout. Curtis contacted London businessman Tony Edwards, who agreed to manage and finance this new band that he was putting together. The first recruit to the band was classically trained organ player John Lord. John Lord got his start in music in 1964 as a member of the Artwoods, a band which also featured Ronnie Wood's older brother on vocals and Keith Hartley on drums. The group's first single was released in October 1964. This was one of the wildest British singles of 1964. The group's sound was a gutsy mixture of rhythm and blues, soul, and a few jazz influences thrown in for good measure. Between 1964 and 1967, the group released 6 excellent singles and a fine LP called Art Gallery. The Artwoods enjoyed great success in clubs all over Britain, but chart success always seemed to elude them. By 1967, however, the music scene in Britain was getting more psychedelic, and the group's popularity in clubs started to fade away. At the time, the success of the film Bonnie and Clyde prompted several bands and artists to adopt a 1930s look and capitalize on the success of the film. For a short period of time in 1967, the 1930s image became very trendy. And in a last desperate attempt to achieve success, the Artwoods jumped on the 1930s bandwagon and changed their name to St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Their last and final single was released in November 1967.
Once I built a tower to the sun, brick and ribbon and lime.
Oddly enough, the song became a massive hit in Denmark. But just like most of their previous releases, the single failed to make a dent in the British charts. Chris Curtis approached John Lord about his idea for a new band shortly after the Artwoods disbanded, and the two became flatmates. While Curtis was putting this new group together in London, John Lord, who was in deep financial trouble, accepted an offer to become a member of the Flowerpot Men's backing band. The Flowerpot Men scored a major hit in 1967 with the song Let's Go to San Francisco. But the Flowerpot Men were not a real band. They were a studio creation featuring a bunch of session musicians and vocalists. One of the vocalists was Tony Burrows, who sang on multiple pop hits from that period. After the success of the single, the record label quickly put together a backing group in order to tour Europe and capitalize on the success of the single. This backing group featured future Deep Purple bassist Nick Simper and drummer Carlo Little. Nick Simper had previously played with artists such as Buddy Britton.
She's about a mover. She's about a mover. Hey.
Simper was also a member of the last lineup of Johnny Kidd and the Pirates, shortly before Johnny Kidd died in a car accident. Luckily, Nick Simper survived the accident, but the bassist only managed to play on the last and final single by the Pirates, a superb song called Send for That Girl. Drummer Carlo Little was also a legend in his own right. Carlo Little had previously played drums for artists such as Cyril Davis and Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages. And he's also famous for being Keith Moon's drum teacher. The drummer is also remembered as the man who turned down an offer to join the Rolling Stones in 1962.
Well, I first met the Rolling Stones when they were a semi-professional group in London. They used to come and see the band I was with, called the Cyril Davis Blues Band, and they liked what they saw and heard and asked me to do a few gigs because they didn't have a drummer. So I went along with them, done a few gigs with them, and they asked me to stay, but you know, there wasn't any money. It was just a semi-pro group, nobody had heard of them. And I said, well, I can't stay, I think I'll have to go back to the band I was with before, and which was Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages. And I said, why don't you try Charlie? Everybody knew Charlie because he used to be around on the scene, sitting in with different bands around the London club scene. I said, why don't you try Charlie? And well, the rest is history. Yeah.
Oh, he walks down the street, they forgot him and says your name, Mary.
Carlo Little had played with Richie Blackmore when both were members of the Savages, and Nick Simper had also crossed paths with Blackmore on several occasions. While touring the Netherlands with the Flowerpot Men, John Lord received a telegram. John Lord remembered.
Then Chris Curtis disappeared. No one at the time knew where he'd gone. I mean, I think certain substances might have had something to do with it, you know, like LSD and all these wonderful things that were available in the 60s. And I thought, oh, well, that was that. You know, it was nice while it lasted, blah, blah, carry on, trying to earn my living as a session musician. I then got a telegram from this guy, Tony Edwards. If you're still interested in forming a band, would still be interested in backing said band, please call, whatever. I mean, I thought, thank you.
One day, while we were on tour with the Flowerpot Men, there's a telegram for John Lord. It must have been early in 1968 or the very end of 67, I can't remember which. We had a tour of Holland, and John was very mysterious, and he said to me, when we get to the hotel, I'd like you to room with me. So as soon as we got the hotel room, he sort of, all furtively, sort of pulled the curtains around it, made sure no one's listening. So, would you give this up, he said. All this money we're making, it was very good money. He said, would you give this money up for a basic wage of, say, £25 a week, which was about a quarter of what we were getting, you know. I said, to do what? He said, to do our own music. I said, you got it, include me in, you know.
John Lord and Nick Simper left the tour with the Flowerpot Men and flew back to London, where they met Richie Blackmore. Richie Blackmore didn't become a household name until he reached legendary status as a member of Deep Purple. But by 1965, Blackmore had already become one of the most in-demand session guitarists in Britain. The guitarist got his start in music as a member of Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages. Blackmore remembered.
The Savages actually kicked me out because I wasn't quite good enough. They'd had some really brilliant lead guitarists. One, I think, was Bernie Watson. So Joe Meek heard about this and said, oh, how about joining my band, the Outlaws? So I said, okay, sounds good to me. I mean, the Outlaws were more well-known than the Savages, so I was quite pleased.
As a member of the Outlaws, Blackmore played on multiple sessions by producer Joe Meek, and the group also recorded several singles in their own right. One of the highlights of his career with the Outlaws was this B-side from 1964, which features a guitar solo that was way ahead of its time. Disc jockey John Peel once said that this B-side was the first heavy metal record. And considering that this was recorded at least 3 years before guitarists like Hendrix appeared on the scene, it definitely sounds way ahead of its time. In an interview from 1983, Richie Blackmore recalled,
Joe Meek had said to me, go crazy, play a very weird solo, bend the notes, and play with lots of distortion and a very freaky effect. And I went, okay. I was quite proud of that solo at its time, which was 63. And when I met Jeff Beck in 67 in the Ship in Water Street, he told me how much Hendrix had liked that particular track. So I was very pleased with that, as I was a Hendrix fanatic and a Jeff Beck fanatic.
Richie Blackmore left the Outlaws in the mid-60s, but he still played on multiple sessions by producer Joe Meek. Some of his best work as a session guitarist can be found on recordings by Hines, one of Joe Meek's protégés. Just like that B-side by the Outlaws, Blackmore's solos sounded way ahead of their time. After his brief stint with the Savages in 1963, Blackmore joined the band again in 1966 and recorded a couple of singles with the group. After leaving Such As Band in 1967, Richie Blackmore moved to Hamburg and formed a band called the Three Musketeers. But by early 1968, he was once again struggling to find work as a musician. But of course, his luck changed when he received an offer to move to London and join this new group called Roundabout. Blackmore met John Lord and Nick Simper in London, and they quickly started looking for a drummer. Blackmore was a big fan of Bobby Clark, and he managed to convince him to join the band. Bobby Clark had been the legendary drummer for Vince Taylor and the Playboys, and Clark had also played for French rocker Johnny Hallyday, one of the biggest rock and roll stars in France. In the early to mid-60s, Bobby Clark was regarded as one of the greatest drummers in Britain, and he was one of the first rock drummers to adopt the double bass drum setup, which of course became de rigueur for many hard rock drummers. Just like Blackmore's guitar playing, Bobby Clark's drumming style was also quite ahead of its time. Manager Tony Edwards, along with two other business partners, agreed to finance Roundabout, and the group moved into Deves Hall, a country house in Hertfordshire, where the band started rehearsing and coming up with musical ideas. Drummer Bobby Clark, however, soon proved to be a problem. Nick Simper said, "It soon became obvious that Bobby was not on the same place as us when it came to musical policy. Me and John had witnessed the mighty Vanilla Fudge in action, and we had listened to Graham Bond and others, and realized that the boundaries of music were expanding rapidly, which had inspired us to look for a new direction. But Bobby, on the other hand, seemed hell-bent on carrying on in the same direction he had been following for the last 10 years. Bobby was unhappy with our musical ideas, and although he reluctantly played along, he often referred to what we played as circus music. The next step was to find a lead singer. The group got in touch with Terry Reid, but the vocalist refused to join. And according to Richie Blackmore, the band also approached Spooky Tooth's vocalist Mike Harrison, but Harrison also declined the offer. Funnily enough, according to Nick Simper himself, future Deep Purple vocalist Ian Gillan was also asked to join the band. At the time, Ian Gillan was a member of a band called Episode 6, a group which also featured future Deep Purple bassist Roger Glover. Ian Gillan, however, also declined the offer to join the band. Nick Simper remembered,
somebody came up with a bright idea of putting an ad in the Melody Maker. So we put this advert in, really pretentious, incredible band seeks incredible singer. And the phone just exploded. I mean, everybody out there just phoned us up. It didn't stop. And then this guy called Rod Evans turned up, and Richie Blackmore remembered him from a gig in Germany. He'd seen him, and he said, "Yeah, that guy's pretty good." And consequently, we tended to give him a little bit more time. But what really made it was the fact that he said, "I've got an idea for the Beatles' Help," he said, "but not the way they do it." He said, "I've got an idea for doing it like a ballad." And he sat down and started doing the Beatles' Help the way we recorded it on the first album, and it just blew us all away, And I thought, this guy, he's got ideas, he can do something different. And that was it. He got the job.
Rod Evans got his start in music as the lead singer of a band called the MI5, a group which also featured a 16-year-old drummer called Ian Pace. The group only managed to record one single in July 1966, and they soon changed their name to the Maze.
I'm so glad, I'm so glad, I'm glad.
Richie Blackmore had seen the Maze in Hamburg in 1967, and he remembered that he had been quite impressed with Ian Pace. Bobby Clark was unable to adapt to the group, so Rod Evans was asked to get in touch with his old drummer. Pace was brought to the house for a quick audition while Bobby Clark and Nick Simper were away shopping, and after the audition, it was decided that Ian Pace was the new drummer. Nick Simper said, "The next day saw the atmosphere worsen, and Bobby confided in me that he was starting to smell a rat. I felt bad at this and told the others that we had to tell him collectively, or I would tell him myself." Panic now set in with John and Richie. Sir Tony Edwards was summoned to give Bobby the news, which he took quite badly. The next day saw Bobby's departure. Bobby shook my hand as he left, and we resolved to stay in touch. Roundabout were now fully formed, and the group was finally ready to tour. During a brief tour of Denmark and Sweden in April 1968, in which they were still billed as Roundabout, Blackmore suggested they should change the name to Deep Purple, after his grandmother's favorite song.
When the deep purple falls over sleepy garden walls.
John Lord, who had achieved quite a bit of success in Denmark with the single by St. Valentine's Day Massacre, was interviewed for Danish television.
John, we met you here in Denmark a lot of times before with the Artwoods.
Yeah.
That became St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
That's right.
And you were very popular, at least here. So why did you leave that group? Why did it break up?
Well, first of all, because I left because the music was going a different way to the way I wanted to go, and I wanted more freedom. We'd been together a long time, and friends are difficult to kind of argue with, so I just thought it best if I leave, try to form my own group.
Did you have this new group, Deep Purple as it's called now, in mind when you left the
Yeah, for a long time,
Artwoods?
yes, for at least a year.
In May 1968, the band moved into Pi Studios to record their debut album, which was released in America in July by Tetragrammaton Records, and in Britain in September by EMI Records. The album featured a cover of a Joe South composition called Hush.
Joe South wrote Hush, but there was I think a guy called Billy Joe Royal had the hit in the States with Hush, a minor hit, and it was being played in a lot of the dance clubs and disco type things in England.
We kind of took it on board because we just loved that. That's almost like a rock and roll samba kind of rhythm, and we just jammed around on it really for a while and decided that it was worth recording. In a time when most singles had to be like 2 minutes 40 seconds, this is quite a bit longer than that, and it has a kind of 45-minute organ solo stuffed right in the middle of it, which was again unusual.
Hush became a massive hit in the States. By September 1968, the song had reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the US and number 2 in the Canadian chart, pushing the Shades of Deep Purple album up to number 24 on Billboard's Pop Albums chart. And as they say, the rest is history. I hope you enjoyed this video about the formation of Deep Purple. See you next time.